Gathering the Nations with Jessica Arianes.
In Genesis chapter 10, and if you can open up your Bibles, what we find in chapter 10 is that there is something called the Table of the Nations. It's where we get the 70 nations. So in that table, we are told of the genealogy of Noah. He had 3 sons, and with them they had their wives. And these sons became the progenitors, and their main offspring are noted in this table in Genesis chapter 10 because these 70 nations would be the very seed line that would be the source of all nations, even the nations that exist today. So when you really stop and think about it, all peoples, all tongues, all tribes trace back to Noah, but back to one of these sons. So what's important to note is that in Genesis chapter 10, it says that the nations were divided. So in 11, this is a small portion, what we find is that there is a term there for language. And many people have taught that Yah came down, saw what they were doing, and then disturbed or confused their language so that they could not understand, because that's how it reads in the English, so that they could not understand one another and continue in their building or their mission. Well, if we go back to Genesis 10, what we see are different words for language. So languages here, it says that Japheth, Ham, Shem, each tribe was sent into an area based on their languages. So what I found is that this word language, it means a language of the tongue. Now the word divided in chapter 10 is parad, and it means dispersed after his own tongue, after their families in their nation. Now a progenitor and their progeny was related by language, not just blood. And remember, there's no borders yet. They haven't migrated from Ararat out into the east towards Babylon yet, or Shinar, Mesopotamia. So if we look at language here, it's Lashon, and if you look at this, it's symbolic for fire, the tongue of fire, but it specifically speaks at that time of a bay, something alongside the seashore, as it's used in Joshua 15:5, Isaiah 11:15. Now, language is also used in 2 Samuel 23:2, as it says that Yahuwah's word was in Samuel's language, in his dialect. So this means to have the tongue, or to have the ability to communicate. Babylon was the land that was lying between the river Tigris and the river Euphrates. There was an upper or a northern part known as Mesopotamia, and then the lower or southern part, which was called Babylon. So Mesopotamia, known in the Babylon tongue as Al-Arak, is modern day Iraq, and Assyria, which was known as Al-Yazira, or what we know today as Al Jazeera, is modern day Syria, or also a part of Turkey. And remember, he's sending them out by every tongue and by every group. All 3, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, are all going out, and they have their own tongue. They had their own writing, which could be the tongue that they were speaking of here, the Lashon, because it's actually the instrument, the anatomy of your tongue. But it could also be, it also is interpreted as wedge, which is what cuneiform was. It was a wedge type of inscription in which they would keep record of things. And it's going to kind of point to the purpose of keeping these records. Now, the Akkadians, who were Shemites, they were Semitic people, came from the line of Shem. They are the ones that invented cuneiform writing tablets for recording. And it was later that the Sumerians, as they became a great power in Mesopotamia and other regions, they then adopted this cuneiform language, and they incorporated it into their legal writing standard. Now, Noah and his family spoke one language. Shem, the eldest, would have maintained that language. Akkadian replaces the local language of ancient Mesopotamia. Hebrew and Arabic become a close relative. Arabic is the sister language or the sister tongue of Hebrew. So they use these familial terms to associate language because, again, language is ascribed to a nation. The native, that's what native tongue means, native to the nation of that people. Now, there were three basic divisions of language. And it's funny because we have the three sons, right? We have Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So the divisions are the northern or northeastern branch known as the Aramaic, the southern, among which the Arabic is the chief dialect and with which the Ethiopic is also connected. And then you have the middle division, which is the Hebrew, with which the Canaanite and the Phoenician, which is also known as Punic, nearly coincide. So remember, in Genesis 10, it says that the people, the progeny of the three sons, they are all kind of divided. They don't have borders yet, but they're like, you go over there, you go over there, you go over here. Now, Japheth became the progenitor of the Isles of the Gentiles, Ehagoim, mostly known as the Sinai Peninsula. It's where they settled once they migrated out. What's interesting to note is Gog and Magog comes from Japheth. Now, the firstborn of Ham is Sidon in Genesis chapter 10, verse 15, which then becomes known as a city in Phoenicia and today modern day Lebanon. Now, what's interesting is that the Canaanites or the Phoenicians traded on the high seas. Remember that. They were known as the greatest traders in the ancient world for the period between 1000 BC and 600 BC. It's a long time. They were highly skilled shipbuilders and sailors. They built strong and fast sailing vessels to carry their goods. Now, their language was known in the Greek and the Latin as Put, P-U-T. The Phoenician became the lingua franca of the maritime Mediterranean during the Iron Age due to the extensive Tyro-Sidonian trade and the Phoenicians' commercial dominance. Now, what is a lingua franca and why is that important? Well, because English is a trade or lingua franca, meaning that it was widely spoken throughout the world. This language in which they were dispersed first was of their own language, even though they may have spoken one language from their father Noah, but they migrated it and they began to develop as a people. They became more dense in population. They may have developed a tongue of their own, a writing system, a numerical system, an alphabet. We're seeing that the Phoenicians had their own writing system. We see that the Sumerians had their own writing system. We see that the Akkadians, they had their own writing system from Shem. So they had their own system of communicating or utilizing the original language. It doesn't mean that it was far from the original Semitic language or the language of Noah. It just means that they may have added to or deduced from the original language in order to sort of facilitate their growth, or maybe they lived in a region that had connection or access to other things that maybe the other region didn't. So they were cultivating their language. And so the lingua franca means that it becomes a universal tongue. And that makes sense. Think about it. It's because the Phoenicians, they were traders on the high sea. And so they're bartering with their brothers and doing business with them. And so that tells you a lot if they have to create a lingua franca that allows them to actually speak the tongue of other nations. So it's like English. English becomes a universal language, and it's for the sake of trading. And modern English was created to trade. It's the language of the prostitute. It's the tongue of the whores. It's not a pure lip. It's the language of many nations. She's got the tongue of many nations. But this is interesting because the definition of this word for tongue is also sand or shores. All right, let's keep going. So that was Ham's lineage, right? The Phoenician language became a lingua franca, which within English is, again, a lot of empty, vain words that have really, truly no real meaning or substantial, no weight to them, right? So they're just sort of lofty words. Now, Shem's real simple. And at the conclusion of chapter 11, It gives you Shem's lineage for a reason, because again, we're always pointing to the many nations and then to the one great nation, which is Yasharel or Israel. So remember, they're dwelling in Ararat or whatever, that region there, right? And so they've migrated yet. In Genesis chapter 9, verse 1, Yahuwah says to Noah, listen, part of the covenant that I'm going to make with you is that you be fruitful, you multiply, you replenish the earth. So the fact that they were supposed to rule over specific things, which was given to Adam, that's part of that government. That's part of that dominion. The laws, the commands were supposed to come from Yah and Yah alone. But what we see through the sons of Noah, including Shem's line, not through Peleg, not through Abraham. That's why Peleg is important, because Shem has other seeds, and through Shem, that line is corrupt. So what we see is that these men, they forsake Yahweh and his commandments, his covenant, his ways, and they make up their own stuff. They make up their own rules. Now, we're going to talk about Mesopotamia. Babylon was in the lower region, Mesopotamia up in the higher region, and so it was divided. So Mesopotamia was also, or currently now, is known as something called the Cradle of civilization. That's important. Also, you can find it under the Fertile Crescent. Now, in Genesis chapter 11, verse 2, it starts off by saying that they went from Ararat to Shinar. It means that they went east. Remember, they would have landed in Ararat, and east of Ararat is in fact Shinar, which would later be known as that, like I said, the Cradle of Civilization or the Fertile Crescent. Now, in Genesis chapter 11, verse 1, and the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. Now, remember, it said in chapter 10 that they were dispersed based on their language. But we saw that was the word lashan, which means the actual tongue, but it could also be a wedge or an instrument of writing. Here, unless there's contradiction, it says that the whole earth was of one language and they had one speech. So why is language and why is speech used? So the word here for language in Genesis chapter 11, verse 1 is safa. And the definition of this word safa is the lip, meaning a boundary or a shore. Lashan is the tongue. Safa is the lip. The tongue is the internal thing. The lip is the external thing, okay? And the definition of this word for safa, which is what they were in Genesis 11, they were of one lip. And that word means a boundary or a shore, which is very similar to Lashan, which means also a bay or something along the seashore, okay? You can find that in Joshua 15:5, Isaiah 11:15. So this word safa in the Greek is the word shore, and it speaks of the innumerable or the multitudes, i.e. the sands of a shore. So he was saying here that the multitudes were of one safa and one speech. So all the people were one. That means that they were echad. They were in agreement. They didn't have any borders yet. They were not divided yet. They were all one landmass, one people. That's what this means. Now, the word here for speech, this is powerful. It's the word dabar, meaning word or command, but specifically a royal decree. For example, the 10 commandments or the 10 words. So it basically, to break it down, it means to be under the same rule or decree, that is to be one, united. Now, it was in Genesis chapter 9, verses 8 through 17, that Yahuwah made a covenant with Noah, his seed. That is the government they were under. They rebel from that government, but that is the oneness that they were under. They were under the commands, the debar, the word of Yahweh. They were in agreement at one point with Yahweh. And what was the covenant? But here in Genesis chapter 9, verse 1 through 9, the same covenant that he makes with the first man in the garden is the same he makes with Noah, the same he makes with us. It's the same. There's only one covenant. It is just, again, progressing even as our responsibilities are progressing, but also even as sin is progressing. It says here in this verse, chapter 9, 1 through 9, it says, to be fruitful, Noah, you and your seed and all of creation, multiply, replenish the earth. Now, when you look at that word replenish, it's the word to fill the earth, to fill it with life, opposed to violence or blood. Now, blood has the life in it. This is why in that same chapter, he gives them the law of retribution there, life for life. Though he says, I will require it of a man who sheds blood and a beast who sheds blood. He knew And as Nimrod came on the scene, we're going to see anti-law. The lawless one comes up on the scene, and he again violates the covenant Yah made with Noah. But we're told in chapter 6 that the reason why the waters came was because they filled the earth with violence. They were, having intercourse with these beings, and they were doing vile things and perverting the earth and desecrating it. And so he's reiterating here. He says, do not eat the flesh with blood in it, a life for a life. Do not kill. And surely your blood, the soul of your life, will I require it. At the hand of every beast will I require it. And at the hand of man, and at the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of men. So remember, there were no borders yet. 3 brothers, bunch of children. They were all family, spoke one language, and they were under this decree. They were under this word, obligated to fulfill it, to do right by one another. So it says in Genesis chapter 11, the whole earth was of one language. They were under one decree. They were all in agreement. They were under the Safa. They had no boundaries. They were of one boundary. They all had, that's what it means, Safa, boundary, one shore, a multitude of people were one, and they were under the covenant or the debar, the command of Yahuwah in Genesis chapter 9. They became part of the Babylonian Empire. So Terah's seed was in Ur of the Chaldees. That would be modern day East Iraq or Turkey. Abraham was brought out of Ur. Now, the oldest settlers in Babylonia known to us were the Sumerians. The Sumerians divided Babylonia, the 2 parts which they called the country of Sumer and the country of Akkad. As they extended their territories northwards, their villages grew in size until they became small towns. And these in turn became cities of very considerable extent. And the power of the gods increased as the prosperity of the people increased. Among the early Babylonian cities may be mentioned Eridu, traditionally regarded as the starting point of Babylonia and Babylonian civilization, also known as Ur of the Chaldees. This was also known as the city of Abraham. And this is what's happening in Genesis chapter 11. They migrate from Ararat to Shinar, and there they begin to develop. They're starting to stake claim to the land, and they were under one order, the right to rule. So the laws of men are established to govern the people. However, all men who rule outside of Yahweh's ordination have always led to oppression of the people and the land. That's how it works. And that's because the installation of that officer is not anointed by Yah. He then receives the applause of men, the approval of men, and it goes to his head. It causes him to be puffed up. That desire becomes so insatiable at some point that you cannot govern it. You become thirsty and hungry for it. And again, you'll go to great lengths to maintain your power and position. Epic of Gilgamesh, who some believe to be Nimrod. And within the writings of the epic, he calls himself God and man. Gilgamesh was making the claim that he had authority and jurisdiction and that his domain was both in heaven and on earth. So the tablets describe his exploits as him being a great, mighty, wise, and learned king, one who was well acquainted with the antediluvian history, a traveler, a mighty hero. He built a great wall. Yet in spite of all his great deeds, he could not prevent the suffering of the people. It is said that the people suffered so greatly from the corvée, which he imposed on them, that they cried out to the gods for a deliverer. Now, a corvée is unpaid forced labor. It also means to be heavy-handed in rulership. We see this with the Pharaoh that came up after the Pharaoh that honored the children of Israel. Again, Egypt being a brother from Ham, being a brother to Japheth and Shem. They're not loving their brother as themselves. They're actually rising up like Cain, brother against brother, doing great violence because of power and rulership. In Pharaoh, regarding Pharaoh, he placed those heavy burdens, that corvée, upon the people so that they cried out for a deliverer, and Yahweh sent them Moshe. So it says in chapter 10, verses 8 through 9, that Cush beget Nimrod. He became, it says, a Gabur in the earth, a mighty hunter in the face of Yahuwah. Now, this actually reads in the Hebrew as he became a mighty hunter in opposition to Yahuwah. Remember, they were all under the order of Yahuwah to not shed blood, to not kill, but to replenish with life, to multiply, natural death, if that was the case because of sin. But Yahuwah was saying, do not murder. We see here that he became a hunter. Now, this is very important because the word Gebur is 1368. It means a child born to rule and govern, spoken of warriors or heroes, champions in battle. Now, back then when Babylon was being established, it says that the cities in Babylon were governed by something called a patasi, known as Geburs or great men, otherwise chiefs. They would quarrel among their neighbors, a house divided, and they would make war upon each other. They would invade one another's borders. The patasi, who succeeded in conquering his fellow patasi, remember the ruler of the city, promptly arrogated to himself the title of Lugal. Now, Lugal in the Sumerian language, in the wedge cuneiform there, means a Gebor or a great man. This one here and then this one here is the full combination, right? This little marking incision is added to this little marking. And as I looked at this marking, I said, it looks like a crown. And sure enough, this little marking here actually means man, and this means great and is in fact a crown. So combined, it means to crown the man, Lugal, or the great man, the Gebor. Nimrod was actually hunting both man and animals. It wasn't just animals. He was shedding blood. Now, the word dominion was considered a confederacy of several cities. They were really trying to work things out. This is why they argued. They were constantly divided. And then one would just then rise up against the other and take over. But a dominion was primarily considered a confederacy. It means many cities working together in conjunction. A Lugal, one who would take over cities or take over regions, he was responsible for all of the cultic activities. He was responsible for arbitration and border disputes, military defense, which was inherited through succession. In other words, his son would inherit that right. He had to be a young man with outstanding qualities from a wealthy landowning family. That means that he would inherit his rights and his possession. This is actually going to be extremely important later on as we start to learn about the Bechorah, the firstborn, and Yahusha actually being the master or the Lugal, actually the chief of chiefs. He's the head of heads. He's the king of kings. He's the El of El. He receives his inheritance. And it's also important to note the book of Acts, and when they are initiating elders, they have qualifications that they have to be men that not of wealth or land owning. In fact, none of those things. They actually had to have the fruit of the Spirit. They had to be gentle and they had to be kind. They had to be patient. These were the attributes of their Elohim that was required for them to govern within their cities. So we see that they began to deviate from the simplicity that was given to Noah and the sons. They started to make up their own stuff. Each city had a patron deity considered the master of the Lugal. These individuals who would exalt themselves into position or put themselves in position of influence or dominance, they would make the claim that they were ordained by their gods, which again is in lieu of Yahweh Elohim, because they know that they weren't. Yah was not putting them in those positions. So in the name of these inventions, and you know that the certain entities, which by the way, Hilal ben Shachar, he is actually known as a militant cherubim. He took with him a legion. That word legion speaks of a military number, a ruler of the angel armies. So he was very versed in military combat and also in government, part of the echelon of the angels or the hierarchy of the angels in heaven. So he would then be part of that inspiration, giving these inspirations to man, because we see that from the beginning, him not willing to do the will of Yah. And through man, he creates suzerain vassal treaties to establish his own rebelliousness or his own laws that are against the law of Yah. These are antichrist, all of them. Christ means anointed. Anti means not. They are not anointed. This is why they have many gods. Under the power, the jurisdiction of these false entities is how they conduct their business. So when regions were dominated by others whose gods differed, especially in war, the subjugated people were forced to adopt those gods as a tribute to the victory given in war. They would force them to take on their language and then to pay homage to their gods in victory. And so it elevated the individuals into believing that their gods were for them and not against them. We just looked at what a gabur was. We looked at what this word meant in regard to these patasy, what it meant that Nimrod became a gabur meaning a child born to rule or born to govern, a warrior who would then create cities. And within these cities, he would build up patacies. And these patacies were also known as gaburs or great men or chiefs. And once they conquered one another, they would be then elevated to the status of a lugal or a king. Now, it says here that he was a hunter. Now, the word hunter is the Hebrew word zayid, to shed blood. So here we see that Nimrod rebelled in the face of Yahuwah, and he went hunting great beasts, including birds and people. In Genesis chapter 27, verse 3, it says that he ensnared them. Job chapter 10:16, Micah chapter 7, verse 2, meaning to hunt down and catch. Speaking of a fowler who hunts or lies in wait for his victim. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, it says, because the accuser of the brethren prowls around seeking one to devour. Now, remember when Satan approached Yahweh on behalf of Job, he said, where have you been? He says, roaming, prowling the earth, roaming the earth, seeking whom I may devour. This was Nimrod. He would prowl the earth, seeking whom he may devour. And he was devouring cities and states. And so this is the epitome of Satan on earth, those rulers who are determined to make all nations and all people one under their rule. Now, again, in Psalm 91:3, it says that Yahweh is a refuge that delivers us from the hunter's snares. And it's interesting because this word for snare is accusation. And again, in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, it says that the accuser of the brethren, the accusations. So we see that later on, spiritually speaking, when it comes to spiritual warfare, we see that the enemy will use accusations against us through our conscience. The fiery darts of the enemy are, in fact, the accusations of condemnation to condemn us so that we fall prey under the weight of that guilt or shame or condemnation. But Yahusha says there is no condemnation given to those who are in him and who love him. Again, even when we fall, we get back up. A righteous man gets back up. Now, back in Genesis chapter 9, verse 2, remember that Yah says to Noah, and of course his sons are there, they're going to hear, he says to Noah, for the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth. Into your hands they are delivered. You can rule over them. You see the tyranny of this Nimrod, this prototype leader or this hunter who would then devour those in fear. See, the spirit of this age that has been from the beginning, it actually dominates through fear. The spirit of dread, which is pakad, which is not the same that is mentioned in Proverbs to have regard, like the fear of Yahuwah is the beginning of wisdom, right? Chapter 10, verse 10, it says, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. That beginning is chief, head, or something that initiates. And so he starts to create these cities. And why? Because within those cities, he's going to put these patacies in place to rule under him. And within Babylon, you had Babel, was a city. Ararat was a Mesopotamian city. Remember the two divisions? Then you had Akkad, which was the city in Shinar before it became Babel. You had Kalna, which was also a city in Shinar. But then you have Ashur. Now, Ashur was a son of Shem, and Ashur would later be known as Assyria. Ashur also built Rehoboth and Kala, which was also a capital, and Rezin, which was a city between Nineveh and Kala, the same as a great city. Now, why is this important? Ashur was nonetheless, in my opinion, from the line of Shem, which proves that even Shem's line was corrupt, which is why Peleg is mentioned specifically, the line in which Abraham comes and Yahweh establishes a covenant through that line. But Shem has a full-on line that's corrupt, enforcing the fact that color of a man's skin, your genetic lineage, has nothing to do with redemption or salvation. All the lines became corrupt. Even the line of Peleg, Abraham's seed, was corrupted. over and over again. All of Noah's sons, Shem, Japheth, and Ham, doing great violence on the earth. And only a very small group of individuals failed, but constantly strove to do what was right in the sight of Yahuwah. And how do you know the difference between those, the remnant and the rest? Is by their works. It's what they strove to do. They tried to do what was right. What marks the man is the God he serves. Yahusha said, you will know a man by what he produces. He'll show you who he's of. He will show you who his God is. He will show you what seed he's from. His own kind. Remember back in Genesis, you eat from any tree that produces a seed after its own kind. People will show us in the midst of conflict, battle, and war, in the midst of trouble, who they belong to. In other words, every man will reflect which king is reigning in his heart by his conduct. Now we're going to get into the one world order. Okay, we just looked at the head or city states. We saw that all of the states that were mentioned, or all the cities that were mentioned in Genesis chapter 10, starting with verse 10, they were all cities and capitals. One world order. So what the heck were they doing in Genesis chapter 11? All right, let me break a few things down for you. First of all, civilization. The term civilization is derived from the Latin word civilis. Other related Latin words are civis, meaning citizen, and civitas, meaning city. The Sumerian writing system, remember the Sumerians and their cuneiform wedge that they stole from the Akkadians, which were Shemites. They are the ones that actually maintained the cuneiform language, and then Paleo and all the Hebrews and stuff. But the Sumerians, they had made their own. Remember, they had their own. Everybody had their own writing system. They were going to eventually create their own laws, their own edicts, their own commands, their own books, their own legislations, their own rules. So the word civis means citizen and civitas means city. Cities are important. Sumerian writing system was predominantly created for the sole purpose of creating legislation. Thus, Sumer was later known by man today as the cradle of civilization. Civilization means governed by a civil court. Civilians who are governed by legislation, who become civilized. In Genesis chapter 11, verse 6, and it says, and Yahuwah said, look, they are one people. They don't have a nation and no nationalities yet. Like they become nations, but they're just one people. And they all have one language. And now they are not going to be withheld from doing whatever they plan to do. So they're planning to do something. Genesis chapter 11, verse 7 says, come, let us go there and confuse their language, so that they do not understand one another's speech. Now back to that lip, it means borders. It means seashore. It means the cusp or the edge of something. So what's being said here in proper context is Yahuwah is saying, look, they're one and they're in agreement. And they're under the rule of Nimrod, who is rebelling against my covenant that I made with Noah by hunting and shedding blood. And he's filling the earth again with blood. And he's going to erect cities, and a great city at that, to elevate himself up to the heavens as God-man on earth. He's going to unite all the people under one rule. Remember that word dabar means order. That word language means border, or it means edge, or it means shores to scatter. They are saying, let us go and confuse their borders so that they do not, and the word for understand is shema, to hear and obey one another. He confused the borders. The word confuse means balal, means to mix, to blend the borders. And remember, I told you that language was connected to progeny. So if you start to mix the seed, you mix the language. This is what was happening. They were creating cities. Now let's talk about law codes real quick. In the beginning, the Ruach was given to man. A fiery tongue. What was the Ruach given? 2 Timothy 3:16, 17? To counsel the man, to direct him, to teach him, to reprove him. Correct. All scripture is Yah breathe, the breath of life, the tongue of life, and is used for instruction, for conviction, for correction, and for training in righteousness, so that the man of Yahuwah may be complete, fully equipped for every good work. The commandments from the beginning were simple: do and don't, live and not die. Once sin entered in, it began to affect the relationship between the suzerain and his vassal. The vassal began to become deaf to the words of his suzerain. His heart waxed cold. He no longer desired to do the work of his suzerain. He wanted to be a free agent, to follow his own will and his own desires. Men were left then to their own devices to be like God, knowing good and evil. That's what judicial lawgiver means. That's what judicial means. It means to be able to judge between good and evil, right and wrong. That's the tree they ate from, good and evil. So even as they partook in that deception, the bread of deceit, the bread of sorrow, they became their own judges, sentenced to death by their own tongues, by their own words, by their own laws. As sin progressed, the need for more laws became necessary. Supply and demand. We have been given the spirit of the law. Thus, love Yahuwah and love your neighbor as yourself, bone of my bone. When the enemy comes into your borders to try to dominate, take authority, subjugate him, rule over the beast of the field, rule over him with the truth. In primitive times in Babylonia, each community formulated its own laws and administered them according to custom. The laws at that time were few and simple. As the land began to prosper and they began to prosper, men and their insatiable desire for power and rule became greater and greater. Insatiable. It means it can't be quenched, can't be satisfied, bloodthirsty, killing anyone who was in opposition to them, anyone who would oppose their conquest. So the laws at that time were drawn up chiefly to protect the property of the god and the community, but the property of the gods were first. These leaders who exalted themselves and put themselves in these domains, they determined that all the tributes that were given to the gods were by proxy theirs. And this is why they wanted more and more and more. The more people, the more tributes, the more wealth they had, the greater their empires, the greater their kingdoms. They realized we can't just force people into labor. So maybe if we incentivize their work, we give them resources, make them think, right, that what they're getting in return is reciprocal, it's honorable, then they'll continue to build our empires. And by the way, there were 3 predominant codes that existed in that time, one of them being the Code of Hammurabi that came later after the conquest of Sargon and the whole Babylonian conquest of the Sumerians. But there were other codes that were enacted as well. And those codes make declaration of only 2 types of people, 2 systems, free and slave. The free men were the ones who were usually in positions of influence, leadership, and wealth. Everybody else was a slave. So this is how it started. This is how the laws of men began. And then why Yah brought his Torah to supersede all these laws. It was always only ever about right ruling, do what's right. Now remember, all of these individuals who are trying to rise up to fame, to create a name for themselves, to establish laws and power and become dictators, all of them come from Noah. They come from either Shem, Ham, or Japheth. They're all brothers, cousins, uncles, nephews, nieces. They're all family, but they're splitting because after when Yah scattered them, he divided their borders. He created borders. I just showed you that within each community or border was now establishing their own community laws, everybody rising up to power. And they began to dominate brother against brother. Cain, am I my brother's keeper? Am I his strong fence? Ach, am I a strong border for my brother? But rather, they violated those borders. They violated the weakness of the people. They took advantage and caused them to become naked and ashamed. They stripped them and sheared them. They raped and molested their own people, kept them impoverished and subjugated for their own greed and wealth and pomp and arrogance, that they might rise above the people and become like gods, knowing how to be judicial, but yet never doing what is right, making legislations and great laws that go into the annals of time, never reciprocating the honor to the people. The people never rose up under the oppressive yoke of these tyrants. Now, executive powers and judicial powers, judges, they put wicked judges in seats. They did what? They enforced the laws. Executive powers, they made the laws. They are building a kingdom of darkness, a kingdom of nothingness, which is in the beginning, Genesis. The earth was tohu vabohu. The earth was invisible. It was unseen. It was the unseen realm. That's why the light came and everything was then now in the light. It was seen. Yah created us to be able to thrive and live, and that means to do what's right. Sin, unfortunately, becomes a thorn in the side of man. Sin becomes an oppressor. Sin becomes likened to Pharaoh, who oppresses the individual. As sin progresses, the thorn is dug deeper. The spear goes into the side of the man, and until that person is dead, completely segregated from the light. They can no longer discern right from wrong. They do what is right in their own eyes. They're fools. They stumble in the darkness, unregenerated without the work of the Mashiach. So now by the power of the Ruach, we can do what's right. Simple. Love your neighbor. Love your Elohim. obey. So legislation, what is it? Legislator was a deliberate assembly with legal authority to make laws for a political entity such as a god or a country or a nation or a city to govern the people. And they would come out with these great policies and say, I determine and I will do great things for the people, and I will alleviate the taxes and the burden of the people, and I will create borders, and I will make walls, and I will stomp out the wicked. And under the legislation, these assemblies would come together, and they were called executive powers and judicial powers. And again, you see that pointing to the Torah, not because Moses was copying these codes of ethics or laws or civil laws. What happened was Satan, he's the spirit of this age. So what is he doing? He's working in the hearts of men, promising them from the beginning that they can be right rulers or they can be judges on the earth. Why? Because he said that he will be like unto God, that is ruling man. Angels are spirits. Man was created to be inspired by the breath or by a spirit, but the spirit of Elohim is right ruling, wisdom, chokmah, mercy, compassion. The spirit of Elohim is judicial. It's equity and justice. It's concerned about the welfare of the poor and the needy. It cares about the widow and the orphan. It cares about its neighbor. But the spirit of Antichrist does not. It's self-centered. It's hedonistic. It's gluttonous. It's thirsty. It's hungry. It's a well that runs dry. Has no living water, no substance in its pursuit. So they would deliberately assemble together with legal authority to make laws. They would say, I have been ordained by my God. Now, why is this important? So within the book of the covenant, cities like the city of David and the city of Jerusalem, they were hubs. They were places in which laws and legislations and rules were established. What is a statute? Statute is a state law enacted by a legislator, like the political power on behalf of a god or on behalf of the country, the nation, or the city. In times of the children of Israel in Canaan, before it became the nation of Israel, it would have been the Torah and then the priest who would be considered the legislators who enacted the Torah as a statute. In the law book, Black's dictionary, these statutes, they were enacted by the legislator. They were called acts, as in the book of Acts. And remember, if a person is under the hegemony of this ruler, if it was an oppressive ruler, which they all are, unless they're ordained by Yah, then they would become slaves and they were oppressed. Then a deliverer or a conquering city would come in, or a ruler from another city, and conquer that city and then supposedly liberate the people from that wicked ruler. Well, Yahusha is in fact our deliverer. And so he came in and he delivers us from the yoke of sin and death. And he brings us into that covenant of life. We have a new government, a new dominion, and it's governed by the power of the Holy Spirit working in you and me. And so that's the same. We see this imitation. We see this counterfeit. For example, these laws were considered code or text, bills or statutory laws or acts, and they were always written. Remember, statutes were state laws, ordinances were local laws. Why did they write them down? Why were they written, codes? So that they wouldn't forget them. There's also a lot of amendments. According to statistics today, there are approximately 200 nations worldwide. What's interesting is that there were 200 watchers. These laws, these governances, these ordinances were not of Yahuwah. They were governed by their false gods, which means that these laws were just as empty as their gods, idle, just like their gods. They're taking counsel in the imagination of their own minds. Now, that was a statue. That's why they wrote them down, so they wouldn't forget. And when they were conquered by another nation, they would then begin to amend those laws. They would look through the annals of the laws or the codex and say, this one worked last year, but this one doesn't work this year. And they were constantly changing it as even the people change, right? Which is why men could not marry men at one point in time. But today the laws have changed, even the laws of physics and the laws of biology. You see, they're just changing the laws all the time. So an ordinance was a local authoritative rule or law within your borders or your region. It was usually in the form of a decree or a command, and it was given as a public injunction, some form of regulation, like don't eat blood, strangled. It was usually given by the city ordinance. And the cities is where they would create these ordinances as acting as authoritative rules. They would create these decrees or commands in the cities. And after a while, they would spread out over the region. They were enforced by judges. And when these local ordinances were violated, you would be taken to the judge, the municipality or the municipal court in order to be arraigned or to be sentenced or to be heard. The judges were elected, always elected within these cities. And these judgments would apply only to local jurisdictions versus state. And again, this is Babylonia. So the state did not have to adhere to the local jurisdictions. All right. Another definition, antinomianism. Antinomianism, nomia means law, and anti means against the law. So now you get it, right? Because Antichrist means not anointed. He's not a priest or a king or a judge. He's self-appointed, and he's received his right to rule by his God who doesn't exist. He's a tohu vabohu. He's confused, and therefore he confuses the people. He really is lawless, even though he applies all these laws and he makes up all these laws and the jurisdictions of men and these ordinances and these judgments, but they're empty. It's lawless. If the law of Yahuwah is righteousness and it leads to right ruling, but if the law has no life or substance in it, which is why Yahusha brings the Spirit, then that means that all these laws that man make, they do not truly govern the man. They're not going to lead you to him. They're not going to lead you to the Creator. They're not going to lead you to salvation. They're not going to deliver you from oppression. They're going to deliver you from sin. No matter how many times you don't run a red light, that is not going to deliver you from sin. So antinomianism is actually what the Antichrist is doing. He's against the law of Yahuwah. That's what Nimrod represented on the earth at that time. In the face of Yahuwah, he was a hunter and he was a Gabor. He was a legislator, a ruler on the earth. And he started what was known now as the laws of men, the government. So now, we are told prior to the injunction made between Yahuwah and Noah in Genesis 9:1 and his seed, that wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was evil continuously. And it says that the thoughts of their heart were constantly evil. There was no regulations, nothing to stop them from giving in to their own impulses, like Cain that turned and killed his brother. Death had never been experienced before. Murder wasn't a thing. The men who were doing what they were doing in Genesis chapter 9, verse 1, when the watchers came down, that they were actually trying to create back then Gabors, because that's the word Gabor that's used there for these men of renown or these champions or mighty men, that they were trying to create men to raise them up to govern the people, that they were actually trying to do what that was being done in heaven, right? Which was this echelon, this power, this domain, but to establish their seats or their government here on earth through the principality of man, because man was given the right to rule over creation, but the beasts of the field. And so I believe that because there was no laws enacted, specifically all of the laws of the land, men were left to their own imaginations. And because they had their imaginations open, these watchers were then able, being spirits, to influence. Remember, the Holy Spirit was given to man as a counselor to correct, to rebuke, to lead, to guide, to give wise counsel, to wisdom, to be a right judge, to be a judge on the earth, to be a right ruler, to do right, to know the difference between good and evil, to know these things. The Ruach has been given to man. But as sin quenches the spirit like a fire, water on the fire, it's still, the man still has within his mind the imagination, the image, the ability to receive counsel. So these spirits would then come to these elected individuals, specifically women, even as the serpent did in the beginning, and then fornicators somehow influence the individual to bring about Gabors on the earth back then. But it didn't work. When Yahuwah saw it, he wiped it out. I'm going to tell you something. This one world order under the government of wicked rulers is supposed to happen, because when it does, it's going to bring the final judgment. And then we see Nimrod trying to do the same thing. Again, right event, wrong timing. And in Jubilees chapter 10, and I was, to my surprise or dismay, it says here, behold, the children of men have become evil through the wicked purpose of building for themselves a city. Remember, the place of legislation, a city, that's where they would make laws and rules and regulate. And a tower in that city. of Shinar. Verse 22, let us go down and confuse their borders, that they may not work together, they may not understand their laws, that they may not understand anymore one another's commands or words, and that they may be dispersed into cities and nations, and one purpose will no longer abide with them. One world order will no longer abide with them till the day of judgment. Chapter 11, verse 2, and the sons of Noah began to war against one another, to take captive and to slay one another, and to shed the blood of men on the earth, and to eat blood, and to build strong cities and walls and towers, and individuals begin to exalt themselves above the nation, and to found the beginning of kingdoms, and to go to war, people against people, and nation against nation, and city against city, and all began to do evil, and to acquire arms, weapons, and to teach their sons war, machinations, and they began to capture cities and to sell male and female slaves. This is what was happening. It had nothing to do with him trying to build an actual building up into the heavens. Isaiah 14, 11, 12, 13, it says the fall of Babylon, the king. Your pomp has been brought down to the grave, to Sheol, along with the music of your harps. Maggots are your bed and worms your blanket. How you have fallen from heaven, O day star, Helal ben Shakar, you howling one, son of the dawn, son of the blending, the confusion. You have been cut down to the ground, O destroyer of nations, with your laws and regulations. You said in your heart that you would ascend to the heavens, that you would raise your throne above the stars of Elohim, that you would sit on the mount of assembly, the far reaches of the north. You said that you would ascend above the tops of the clouds, that you would make yourself like the Most High, but you will be brought down to Sheol, to the lowest depths of the pit. Those who see you will stare. They will ponder your fate. They will say, listen, is this the man who shook the earth and made the kingdoms tremble, who turned the world into a desert and destroyed its cities, who refused to let the captives return to their homes? All the kings of the nations lie in state, each in his own tomb. But you are cast out of your grave like a rejected branch, covered by those slain with a sword, and dumped into a rocky pit like a carcass trampled underfoot. You will not join them in burial, since you have destroyed your land and slaughtered your own people. The offspring of the wicked will never again be mentioned. Prepare a place to slaughter his sons for the iniquities of their forefathers. They will never rise up to possess a land or cover the earth with their cities. I will rise up against them, declares Yahweh of hosts. I will cut off from Babylon her name. They want to build a name for themselves, and her remnant, her offspring, and her posterity, declares Yahweh. I will make her a place for owls and for swamplands. I will sweep her away with the broom of destruction, declares Yahweh Sabaoth. So Satan rebelled against the charge of Yahuwah, as did the other hosts of heaven, to do their own will, to do what they desired. We see this seed of rebellion working in the sons of lawlessness. They're doing all these other laws. That is the fruit of lawlessness. They refuse to do the law of Yahuwah, to do what's right. They rather do all these other laws. They rather create United Nations and all these forms of government and legislations, and go behind secret doors and make all these laws on behalf of the citizens while they get rich and increase. That's why if you look at these places in which they conduct their business, they are filled with the images of false gods, Athena and Hermes, and all their gods that they ascribe their authority. That's what they're doing. Go look at the apotheosis that's in the Capitol, and you will see all the gods in whom he is surrounded by on his throne. And you will see that he exalted himself to create laws for America, which they blended the law of the Mosaic laws along with their own laws in order to reconstruct their kingdom on earth, all the kings of the earth. And you'll see Venus, who is not Yahusha, not the morning sun or star or whatever, but you will see that they're false gods from the heavens, these legions or the armies of Satan that he took with him 1/3, the council or the echelon of heaven, and they ministered to these men from the imaginations of their minds, giving them the illusion of pomp or great works and feats, and wrote their names down in books, and they became historical figures embedded in time to live forever in the minds of men, so long as they're spoken about, so long as their books are read, so long as history doesn't change. The antediluvian man was lawless. He did what was right in his own eyes. Romans 7:7 says, "What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Yah forbid. Nay, I had not known sin, but by the law, for I had not known lust, the desire of my heart, except the law had said, do not covet. For without the law, sin is dead or inactive," meaning sin had no power or effect to charge a man with guilt. However, if we do away with the law, what are we left with? Antinomianism, lawlessness, doing what is right in our own eyes. We're left to either the state before Noah or the state after Noah with a bunch of laws. The only way that a man can be governed rightly is with the law of Yahuwah and his Ruach, the way he created us. Yahusha satisfies the law perfectly. He was fruitful, he multiplied, he replenished, he subdued, so that we might live and not die. So the demand for payment, which was death, is alleviated by mercy. Forgive them, Father, he says, for they know not what they do. Jonah chapter 4, verse 11, of Nineveh, the Assyrians, they could not discern their right hand from their left. And in Ecclesiastes chapter 10, verse 2, it says, a wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. And what does Yahusha say? Of all those who are to my left, you shall be thrown into the fire. You left hand, you left eye, you wicked shepherds. They could not discern right from wrong as the left from the right. The tree of good and evil, right? They were not judicious. They didn't have right ruling in Nineveh. But it says Nineveh was willing to repent, that is, to do what's right. And once they were made known of their error and received deliverance, even so the law reveals, yet repentance leads to salvation. Jubilees chapter 10, and they may be dispersed into cities and nations, and one purpose will no longer abide with them until the day of judgment. So that one world order will not happen until it's supposed to. Then will be the day of judgment. Mark chapter 7, verse 8 through 9. The precepts of men, laws of demons. They worship me in vain. They teach as doctrines the precepts of men. These are ordinances, precepts, commandments. That's precepts. Go look at what doctrine means. Ordinances, laws, edicts. They teach legislation of men. Verse 8. But you neatly set aside the command of Elohim to maintain your own council of the city of Jerusalem, your own legislations. Tower of Babel. Babel was a city. Genesis chapter 11. Verse 4, it says, let us build a city. The word for city means to open the eyes, to awaken, to watch, like the watchers, from the word meaning to open the eyes. And what happened with Hawa? Her eyes were open, right? The tower that they were building was the patron temple. So not only were they building patron temples of that time, but they were also building their seats or their thrones. The word tower is the word migdal. Migdal is a central defense in the center of the city. That can also mean a structure to stand on or to address a crowd. In the modern English, it would be a pulpit. So interesting, because this place that they were building in Babel, the city, was a place that they called the eye. And then they were creating a structure in the center of the eye in order to regulate or address the crowd, a pulpit. Was one of the world's first true cities, urban centers of commerce and administration with systems of laws and regulations, codes of ethics and morals, known today as government. So now this makes sense. The New Jerusalem, the city that comes down to govern. So we have the city of David, or Jerusalem, and then we have the Mount of Zion. Remember, it said that Hillel ben Shakar, that he's going to create a city and he's going to dwell on the mount of the assemblies of the congregation. See that? The counterfeit. In Genesis chapter 11, verse 4, what do they say? They say, let us make our mark. That word is Shem. It means a name or a memorial, in one accord, one rule, one people, one law. He was trying to establish his throne there in Babel. Genesis chapter 11, verse 5, it says that Yahuwah came down to see the city and the tower. In verse 6, it says, and they are one, he said, with one border. This coming together in one border somehow affects the possibility of the imagination. Because then he says, therefore their imaginations will have no limits. Then he can move in the imaginations of the minds, and he can elevate himself. He can sit on his throne in the minds minds of men. So having this one border somehow leads to their imaginations being limitless. Verse 7, Genesis chapter 11, verse 7, it says that he confound their language. He mixed their borders. When he changed the borders and he delineated limitations or borders, then what happened was they began to create laws within their borders. God didn't confuse their language, their lingua. They were of one language. They developed the writing system because of their laws, and then their language, which reinforced it. They had orators who would give the oracles or orate the codes, and then they had legal codes that were written. And guess where they would put those codes? They would put them on the posts or the gates, so that when you walked into the cities, especially if you were a visitor or a foreigner, the laws would be written and established. And so it's funny that Yah uses that word established when he says, I will establish my covenant with an individual. It points to that he's going to write his covenants on the doorposts of our heart. For the most part, the people in that region that were developing were polytheistic. The Assyrians had their own gods, but they were called chief rulers. Inanna, for example, or Ishtar, the patron god of fertility and love for the household. But for the cities or for the legislators, she was the god of divine law and political power. Originally worshipped in Sumer, she was known by the Akkadian Empire, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians as the Queen of Heaven. Colossians 1:15 through 17. Of Yahusha, it says that he is the image. That word image, we're going to look at it, is representative. Image is the word zalem. It can also be an idol or a statue if it is devoid of the ruach or of life. Thus, fallen angels or spirits would inhabit these idols and or inspire men. So the word zalem, which means image, is used in Genesis when Yah created the man. He said, in our image. It meant that he was not animated yet. He didn't have the force of life, the source, the breath of life. This is what it means to blaspheme the spirit. Satan has blasphemed the spirit, acting as though he is the spirit of wisdom, Sophia, right? This false wisdom that leads to destruction, an angel of light enlightening the eyes of men, but actually blinding them with laws and regulations that do not lead to salvation, but lead to eternal death. Therefore, when these men would create these false gods in order to authorize themselves, oftentimes, and even currently today, these entities will inhabit a idol or something of some sort and convince the individual that they have this authority or this power to do something according to their own will. They would minister to the individual within his fantasy and then appeal to his desires and his lust for more. And so they would puff up the individual, and they would build altars and idols in the shape of these chimeras. And then these spirits would inhabit these chimeras and then influence the individual. And they would say, I've been authorized by Inanna, by Uruk. These legions or these warring angels would teach men how to war, how to create laws and legislations in order to sort of advance their domain or their territory. Well, it says of Yahusha that Yahusha is the image or the representative of the invisible El, that he's the firstborn of every creature. For by him were all things created that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether principalities or powers, thrones or dominions. He is above all and all. He is above all the powers, whether they are seen or unseen, whether they are in heaven or on earth. The word for thrones here is thronos, and it means a seat with a footstool, as an emblem of royal authority over those city domains. Dominions is the word kuriotes, which means civil power, the authority to make rules and laws and legislations. He's saying, I'm above all your laws, all your rules, all your codes of ethics, all of your dominions, all of your legislators, all of your kings and queens, and all of it. In Ephesians chapter 1:21, 2 Peter 2:11, 1:21 says that Yahusha is far above principalities, powers, and might. The word principality is arche. Again, all of your chiefs, your heads, your legislators, your establishments, and guess what, Nimrod? Even your beginnings. That word means that which gives you permission to perform your angels, your idols, to give you power and strength, your money, your resources, your guns, your weapons, your technology. I'm above all your powers. I'm above even your might, which is dunamis. That means intrinsic power that comes from you, your will. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12 says, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against what? Those principalities, against these powers, these rules, these laws, these legislations, these rulers of the darkness, these emptiness, and these darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in what? In high places. One world order. So let's talk about Arthur Balfour. He was Britain's foreign secretary. Now we're talking about powers, principalities, rulers, thrones, all the things, right? We see now that they're just men who create laws and rules. Now, with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire during World War I, Britain took over Palestine. In 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, which declared its intent to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And so he wrote a letter to the Rothschilds, who was a Zionist, who would then eventually establish what was called the national state of Israel. But it was called a state. And it was then under the rule of the United Nations, under the rule of man's laws, not Yahuwah's. So here they're returning the Jews to Palestine. Zionist Rothschilds, super rich, right? Part of the banking kings, part of the bankers, the red shields. Rothschild means red shields, which means Edom, which means Esau, which means Herodians. We know all this already, right? So, but we're not dividing, because remember, he scattered their borders. He scattered their borders. So within their borders, they would create their own laws and their own languages and their own writings and their own codes and their own ways of doing things within their country, so that they would go to war with each other. Yah did it on purpose. Why Yahusha says, don't worry about it. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, don't worry. It's not the end. That's not the end. When you hear about calamity and earthquakes and all these things, that's not the end. All right, 1918, there was an Arab revolt because bin Ali of Mecca, who claimed to be the descendant of Muhammad himself, thereby being authorized by Muhammad because of his lineage, they went and they revolted. They helped the Britons win the war against the Ottoman government during World War I in conjunction with the British support. Now, the main aim of the revolt was to, again, establish an independent Arab state with Hussein as king. Now let's go back to Zionism. So now they're working Zionism. We got this foreign secretary along with all these rich backers, and they're basically appealing to the Zionist Congress, basically saying, hey, we want you guys to be an independent state. But on the other side, they're saying to the Arabs, no, we want you guys to be an Arab nation. But who's running it all? The Brits. Theodor Hertz. He was an Austrian Jew. And Theodor Hertz, he actually formed the Zionist organization, and he promoted Jewish immigration to Palestine during that time. In an effort to form that Jewish state, he was the king of propaganda. He actually had a great audience and a way with words, such that he wrote the pamphlet Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state. That's where he promoted the idea. But it wasn't enough. Although it was enough to actually influence all the fearful Polish Jews or the Austrian Jews, or shall we say Japheth, or the European Jews or the European people, even though it was semi-successful at getting the people to consider the idea that they would go back to a barren land. Only these little Palestinians lived. There was no cultivation. There was no resources. And on top of it, they were going to be surrounded by the Arab nations, their brothers, who they kind of ripped off and had qualms with. Do you want us to go back? So guess what happens? World War I, right? The whole Hitler thing. We're going to push these people out and get them back in the land, because fear and dread will govern these people. They were weak. They were poor. The majority of the people that went back, they were poor. They were so poor they didn't even know their right hand from their left. They didn't know anything. They didn't have resources. And then they were stripped. Obviously, the wealthy ones, the influential ones, were stripped by Hitler, right? Now, the first Zionist Congress took place in Basel, Switzerland. Hertz was there among all the other federations of Zionists. And it was then after that Basel actually quoted this quote and said, "It is I who have founded the Jewish state. However, if I said this out loud today, I would be greeted by universal laughter. However, he says, in 5 years perhaps, and certainly, most definitely in 50 years, everyone will perceive it. What was he talking about? A Jewish state. Guess what? The time that he said it, 50 years later, it actually came to pass. That's when Israel became a Jewish state. It's a Jewish state. Now, George Lloyd, another player in the scheme of things, he was a Christian zealot, and he was also the prime minister of the UK. He also pushed the Zionist agenda because remember, even though Der Judenstaat was very appealing because they offered these poor people, these stripped people who just came out of the trauma of war and gas chambers, which, by the way, the Holocaust is the word for burnt offering. Were they a burnt offering? So during the burnt offering, these people were then brutalized and wiped. So whomever was left was the least of the least, with no names, no birth certificates, no trace. You notice they mixed up the families. They took the children away. They threw them all over the place. They confused them. They marked them with numbers, and they had no way that their next generation would truly know who they were. And then they said, we're going to offer you money, education, homes, land. We'll protect you. We're protected by the United Nations. But they were still a little skeptical, and they were here in the Americas and Spain and other places, I don't know. And they were kind of like, we're safe here in the U.S. borders too. So this guy, George Lloyd, he was a Christian. So he was like, we need to get the Christians involved. So what does he do? He pushed the Zionist agenda among the Christians as biblical prophecy. He then began to teach at the pulpits, and he began to use his influence as prime minister to actually mobilize this movement by saying that this is prophecy being fulfilled, that Yah would bring his people back to the land, that he would restore the scattered tribes of Israel and create a Jewish Zionist state. But under Yah's rules, laws? No, under the United Nations and the rule ultimately of Britain, Great Britain, the dragon. Now, Britain and the Russians, they are the two main players. So remember that Game of Thrones I told you? Well, there's actually a theory out there called the Great Game. The Great Game was a rivalry between the 19th century British and Russian empires over influence in Central Asia, also known as the Heartland or the Rimland, also known as the Arc of Instability, where forever there have been wars and rumors of wars over Mount Ararat and Babylon, and where the civilization began, and the city-states, the great city, the whore. Now, the geopolitical paradigm of Halford Mackinder's, he's the one that coined the term, the geographical pivot of history, or the heartland theory. So remember in the beginning I told you that Sumeria, Mesopotamia, they would later be known as these regions, or the region of the heartland or the rimland. There's the heartland is the land portion, and the rimland is the water portion, the seas. So Mackinder's, his heartland theory basically states that the power that controls Central Asia, also known to him as the Great Pivot, would eventually emerge as the most powerful state in international politics. However, geopolitical theorist Nicholas John Spikeman says this regarding his theory of what he calls the geography of peace. There has never really been a simple land power, sea power opposition. The historical alignment has always been in terms of some members of the Rimland with Great Britain against some members of the Rimland with Russia, or Great Britain and Russia together against a dominant Rimland power. The surrounding, that is the Rimland, string of marginal and Mediterranean seas, which separates the continent from the seas, completes a circumferential maritime highway, which links the whole area together in terms of sea power. So I say to you, what Nimrod was striving to accomplish in Babylon, which was a one world order, it began there and it will end there. Nicholas Spikeman, his quotes are regarding land power and sea power, the two beasts, one that comes out of the sea and one that comes out of the earth, saying the one who controls the rimland, the seas, maritime law, will rule Eurasia, and the one who controls Eurasia, The land controls the destinies of the world. So remember the schemes of the enemy. Yah is not allowing it to happen until it's time, because they can't do anything unless Yah advances it, and it's already written and in motion. They are only given over to the illusion of power. Genesis 10 says, all went out after their own families, tongues, countries, and nations. And in Revelation chapter 7, verse 9, before the judgment of the nations, it says, and the multitudes come back home, and they return too great to number, every nation, every tribe, every people, every